welcome everyone this evening. I'm Diane Cheseldine, the founder of the Distinguished Speaker Series, and we're just elated to see all of you here this evening for something we've been planning for Grouse Age, and excited to have you here with us. Welcome community members, faculty, staff, and students to our first distinguished event of the new academic year. And it is indeed an important, can you hear that all right? No, I guess I can't tell from this side of it. It is indeed a very important event for all of us who live in the West, and tonight especially for those of us here in Nevada. Our hope is that by the end of this evening, you will have a clearer idea of the different perspectives that are connected with the upcoming decision on September 30th, whether or not to list the Greater Sage-Grouse on the endangered species list. I want to thank the many people who have helped to make this evening possible, among them especially the committee for the Distinguished Speaker Series, our media sponsor, KNPB, Public Television, and Tia Flores, who is a noted local artist, who has donated the beautiful gourd that you saw when you came into the auditorium this evening. It's just exquisite, and she told me that I believe you're going to have it the cover for your calendar this year. Is that right, Tia? And I'd like to have a promo about Tia. I believe you're going to be part of a book of noted women artists in Nevada that's coming out. Is that right, Tia?
Yes.
That we will be raffling that off at the end of the program. And I wanted to let you know that we will be using those proceeds to begin a scholarship for a TMCC student. And it will be a competitive scholarship and based on a creative project submitted by the students. We're going to have, we've designed the evening to have two parts, I guess you would say. The first part, the producer of the nature documentary titled The Sagebrush Sea, which was broadcast in May, has graciously joined us this evening. He's come from Virginia to be with us, and he will introduce the evening and has selected some clips to give you an overall idea of some of the information that you'll be hearing about this evening. And the second part will be followed with a panel discussion by local experts in varying fields who have graciously also offered their time, experience, and knowledge. So there's part one and part two. So thank you again for coming, and I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Marc Dantzker, the producer of the Sagebrush Sea.
Hi. How do I come across? Okay.
Sound great.
You can hear me out there? You're right. You can't tell how loud you are here. All right. So thanks so much for having me, Diane. That was really nice. And as Diane said, this is a two-part show. So I'm part one. And we're going to make sure we leave plenty of time for part two. I'm very excited for part two, which is the panel discussion. I've been going around the western states that are affected by this issue, participating in, watching, listening in these kinds of panels, and I'm really interested. I don't know a lot about Nevada sage-grouse issues. I'm sort of I take a slightly 30,000-foot kind of view of the whole issue. So I'm excited for the second half. I'll make sure I leave plenty of time for it. Brett Boyd is going to be introducing that. Is going to be moderating that from PBS. So that's exciting. So in the first 40 minutes, I'm gonna show some excerpts in a bit, but I also want to try and give some context. I generally try and show the whole film, because we made a film, it's 50 minutes long, it tells a story, and it's hard to tell that story shorter without a really good editor. So what I did is we pulled out some excerpts to show you guys, but I'm gonna use my voice in this PowerPoint here to try and put some context around this for you guys that I don't usually do. I want to tell you a little bit about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the institution that employs me and made this film. I want to give you a little background on the Greater Sage-Grouse. I think that then we'll go a little bit more into the film itself. I think it'll be fairly obvious by then why we made this film. And then I'll show you some excerpts of the film. And so this will be about, I don't know, you'll see plenty of grouse, I promise. Just first about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I have the good fortune of working for a group that makes beautiful multimedia. So rather than tell you about our group, I'm going to show you just a little 2-minute trailer about our group. The narrator of this is the director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. His name is John Fitzpatrick. We are in upstate New York. You will see a picture of the lab as well. But I will cue this, and we'll see if the audio is working. It's a good test for the system.
When you look into the eyes of a bird, it's very easy to suddenly recognize that is a living, breathing, conscious being. If there's one basic thing that the lab stands for, it's the idea that we have an opportunity to make a difference. The difference that we can make is brought about by the fact that we watch, we observe. That's fundamentally what science is. We're built around the idea that we're curious about how nature works. We're curious about how nature's doing. The more we look, the more we listen, the more we understand. The fantastic thing about birds is they actually allow us access to the very little details of the living world. Because birds give us this microscope into how nature works so beautifully. We can look closely at how they interact with their food, with their shelter, with their places for nesting, and with one another. Birds give us access to how nature works in ways that most animals don't. There's art in nature and there's science in nature. And then there's the teaching that one can do from putting those together. And all of these ultimately culminate in the same place. We can't help singing about it because it's so spectacular. And that all comes from the fundamental human privilege we have. It starts with being able to see something, to listen to something, to think about it, and to reflect on it. There's nothing that's more beautiful and fulfilling and potentially explosively life-changing than simply observing nature.
Well, I couldn't have said that better myself. It's kind of cheating when you have really pretty stuff like that. But that's what we do at the Lab of Ornithology, and I'm a producer in the media group there. I'm actually a former biologist. I shouldn't say that because I still occasionally do science. But I mostly just produce shows for education, outreach, conservation. And this is my first show for television that we produced. Before we get a little bit further, though, let me tell you a little bit about the bird and why we're all here. This is the Greater Sage-Grouse. How many people have seen the Greater Sage-Grouse actually in the world? Oh, wow, that's really good. That's really good. So the Greater Sage-Grouse is an alarming animal, an absolutely beautiful animal, and as spectacular as anything in that reel that you just saw from around the world. And I've been studying the grouse since the 1990s when I did my doctoral research on their very odd mating displays. And I am happy to talk with you about the bioacoustics of sage-grouse mating displays, but I am not here to do that tonight. About in the 90s is also when the alarm bells started going off about the populations tanking of sage-grouse. And it's not something I was tuned into at the time until much later. But here's a good map. Maybe I'll use a laser pointer. You can see, I don't think you can see the key. This right here, this khaki color here is the historical range of the Greater Sage-Grouse. And the green is where they remain. And that's about half of the area that they previously occupied. That's actually not that bad. I mean, when you think about it, it sounds sort of bad, but when you think about the world that we are in now and how much we've changed it, half isn't terrible. But the population was estimated, and the estimates vary, but the population is estimated to have been at least about 16 million. The lowest estimate's about 5 million. Now we're in these down here. We're in the 500 to 200,000 range. So we've seen a major change over time. This is a bird whose populations oscillate a lot, but this is a radical tank from where they were before the white colonial expansion across the West. And so this kind of a picture is what put the bird on as a candidate for the Endangered Species Act, and it's a long story. The saga of the sage-grouse and the Endangered Species Act is a long story, and we're coming up on the end of the beginning of the story for the Greater Sage-Grouse. It's a longer story still, because we're going to find out whether or not the bird's going to be listed as an endangered species or not this month. But the conservation strategies that are going to be required to put this bird and this ecosystem back on the right path, those strategies have largely been worked out by groups like the ones you're going to hear from in a little bit, and codified through the BLM, and worked up through bills in the U.S. Department of the Agriculture programs. So there's a lot of work that's going to go on over the next number of years, regardless of the listing. And I'll cut only to the point of saying that on the listing, the only thing I'll say is that conventional wisdom is that the bird will not be listed. That's conventional wisdom. It's probably true. That doesn't make it any less dire, but the reason for that is because of the extreme efforts of people like the ones in the panel here, and the people that they represent, who have done a tremendous job turning this thing around, and creating a framework that could actually conserve this bird and this place. So I belong to a camp of people who believe that we have done so much through these efforts that this is the largest conservation effort in the United States ever, and I've heard that said by the Secretary of the Interior, that this is such a massive effort that we really have to give it a chance. And we have to give it a chance, not just time, but effort and understanding. So that's where we sort of come in. We looked at this and we said, well, one of the problems that the Greater Sage-Grouse has is that there's not that much out there in the sagebrush, right? It looks big and empty. And we've heard a lot of people say over time, including some former secretaries of the Interior, who said, well, it's a good thing they put all that oil and gas out there because there's nothing there to disturb. And so it's very easy, if you think there's nothing there, to turn that first gorgeous vista of sagebrush into this. This is Wyoming. You don't have to own this one. That's what they do up there to their sagebrush. But we impact the sage in all sorts of different ways. And what we felt when people came to us and said, well, what can you guys do to help with this sage-grouse issue? We thought, well, what we can do is not to trivialize it, but take really pretty pictures. I mean, this thing needs a PR campaign. You can't think of it as flyover country. You can't think of it as a wasteland. You can't think of it as empty. Or you can't care. And caring actually does matter. Maybe it shouldn't matter. Maybe we should preserve things just because we should preserve things, but we don't. Caring helps a lot. So we produced a show, and I'm going to show you some more excerpts, but I think I'll start off just quickly by showing you the trailer to the show. The show's already aired, but it's still a pretty good representation across the whole thing.
On an icy plateau, a lone performer takes the stage. In a deep freeze with 40-mile-an-hour winds, he begins his ancient display. His plumage is designed to dazzle. Key to his success is to stand out in this vast expanse. His home is often called the Big Empty, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Those who look closely will discover a landscape full of life. On this stage, the struggle for survival has played out for millions of years. But change is on the horizon, splintering what remains of the wilderness, forcing those who call this home to face an uncertain future.
Yeah, well, that date's already passed. But we were really excited when PBS agreed to air the show. We made the film with the idea that we would have to work very hard to get anybody to see it. And it ends up, they aired it, and about 1.3 million people watched. And it's going to air again next week. I'll mention that at the end so you don't forget. And it's available online. About 100,000 people have watched it online. And I've been touring the West with the film for some time. We're now working on making educational films that will be used hopefully over the next few decades to teach people about the sagebrush, because an hour-long film doesn't play as well in the classroom as a 15-minute short. So the reception's been really good, and the timing was very specific. We started 3 years ago making this film, but we knew when this date was coming, and we knew we had to be out before it and help raise interest and profile in advance of the actual listing decision. So we started 3 years ago, and it's been alarming to see how much of a buildup there is. Today, I grabbed snippets from the internet. I used older ones until now, and then I decided I would grab ones from today. This is The Hill, which is a blog, really, and almost anybody right there, but this one is from somebody you might recognize. Her name's Gail Norton. She was Secretary of the Interior. This is from today, talking about the importance of basically protecting species before they get on the endangered species list. I thought this was interesting because when I was doing research early on, I heard that Gail Norton had told the head of BLM Sage-Grouse work that the sage-grouse would never be listed on her watch. I think she meant that at the time, not so much about conserving it so it didn't get listed, but just that it would have tremendous economic consequences. But now she seems to think conservation is important, which is good. Here's the New Yorker. This is also, I think, either from today or yesterday. Will the sage-grouse win the West? Again, this topic of whether or not the sage-grouse are going to be listed and how that's going to impact things is really top of mind. This is Energy and Environment News, which is not a liberal publication, but a fairly balanced source talking about the Great Basin and how wildfires may decimate grouse populations by 2040. Fires are a huge deal here, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that from the panel. This is actually referencing this paper, which just came out today as well. And that's pretty dramatic right there. So here in Nevada, you steward a lot of our nation's sage-grouse. That's how I like to think of it. It's the federal lands, have a lot of the birds. This is range-wide. Federal lands are 64%, 70%. I don't know what it is in Nevada. Somebody can correct it. I'm sure it's slightly different. But mostly on federal lands, and about 14% of them here in Nevada. So you're one of the very key states, and also that means the most impacted states. Because I think I'm the only one with a PowerPoint, I figured I would put up an actual map of the Great Basin and the sage-grouse populations. Grouse gather on these little leks, which are these tiny little black dots in here. These yellow regions are the core areas, as defined, 75% areas. These are the areas that are most important to protect, and the ones that the regulations and rules that are going into effect will most affect. Again, just because we could get rid of all the other stuff, that's Nevada. That's the area you're interested in. And so we made this film to try and create an atmosphere where it's harder to ignore what's going on out there. Let me, I think hopefully you understand a little bit more about where we are and what our motivation was for doing the film. What I'd like to do now is just show you some excerpts, which I think will mostly take me through my time, and then we'll switch over. So here's some 13 minutes of the Sagebrush Sea.
In this rugged landscape, life has found a way to thrive. Winter is over, but a final blizzard forces itself onto the first days of spring. The locals here are accustomed to extremes. They've adapted to survive where others cannot. One in particular, the Greater Sage-Grouse, is found no place else. Despite the late snow, the lone performer begins his spring ritual. Instinct tells him it's time. His story actually began 3 years ago with his father on a nearby stage. He's not alone. Males from across the range are arriving to spar for female attention. Their elaborate display has only one purpose: to pass on their genes to the next generation. But self-promotion on an open stage is risky. This is the heart of the West. An ecosystem that once stretched 500,000 square miles across North America. Today, only half of that remains. The melt reveals a sea of sage. Sage is the anchor of the high desert. Without it, the land would be a dust bowl. These twisted shrubs can live 140 years. Extending for hundreds of miles in every direction, they're the foundation of this wilderness. The wildlife here has evolved with the sage for over 2 million years. On the flats below lies the home of the grouse, They've spent the last 8 months hiding. But in early spring, their genetic imperative draws them to these open stages. Years of thaw and evaporation have left patches of salty sediment. The grouse use these clearings as leks, gathering sites for their mating ritual. As other males approach, the contest begins. They only have a few weeks before the females arrive to establish their dominance and a territory. Pairs square off, facing just past each other. And then... fights are ferocious and frequent. Males battle dozens of times a day. Serious injuries are rare. Mostly, it's a battle to exhaustion. The chance to mate only comes once a year, and for grouse, years are limited. Most males won't live more than 4 years. They might well only get 2 chances to breed, if they survive. Sage has sustained pronghorn and mule deer through the winter. With the melt, the deer head off to their summer ranges in the mountains. Pronghorn migrate within the sage. These antelope are the fastest sprinters on the continent, adapted to outrun the American cheetah. The cat is long extinct, but the pronghorns still run. When temperatures warm, the high desert comes to life, revealing the diversity hidden through winter. Hibernators surface from below. Prairie dog families excavate new tunnels, preparing for their pups. A badger digs her underground den, where she'll soon give birth. Short-horned lizards emerge with the ants. The timing is critical, since ants are their sole source of food. And jackrabbits have shed their winter white, confirming that spring has arrived. The Sage Sea is filling with new life, and everyone is hungry. Each year, migratory birds fly hundreds, even thousands of miles to raise their young here. They synchronize their arrival with the emergence of insects. Some return to the exact same spot year after year, finding their small crevice once again in this vast expanse. For cavity nesting birds, rocks are the trees of the desert. Bluebirds use holes like these in place of hollowed trunks. Despite their brilliant blues, females pick their mates, mostly for the quality of his shelter. The tiny American kestrel is the only falcon in North America that uses cavities. With their ultraviolet vision, they track rodents by following their urine trails. Rock wrens nest between stones on the ground. They're highly adapted to life in the desert. Like many other desert dwellers, they get all their water from the insects they eat. Once the sun falls in the desert, temperatures can drop by 40 degrees, and creatures of the day give way to those of the night. Ravens and bluebirds, grouse are tied to unbroken expanses of sage. Without it, the species would cease to exist. The sagebrush sparrow would also disappear. Each year, they return here to lay their eggs. They breed nowhere else. The sage thrasher and brewer's sparrow do the same. Though their songs are beautiful, their feathers are drab to blend into this landscape. Without the sage and the nursery it provides, these species would be lost. Sagebrush is a nursery for plants as well. While it's toxic for most animals to eat, it's actually called a nurse plant because its shade and roots help other plants grow. This land, which might at first appear empty, is far from just a place in between. It's a 140-year-old sagebrush and a constant wind that carries its scent. It's the clatter of antlers and the beating of wings as migratory birds come and go. It's a soaring raptor and a rare performer that takes a chance each year on the open range. An ancient stage where evolution has slowly shaped the lives of those who live here. It's a once vast wilderness, no longer untouched, with a future as uncertain as the survival of an uncommon bird.
All right, so those are your excerpts. Thanks. Now, I know there's one question on your mind right now, and where can I see the full thing? That's what you're all thinking. And so, fortunately, I have a great answer, which is that it's on PBS this next week on Channel 5, KNPB, at 8 o'clock. It's also on every other PBS affiliate, so you can tell your friends to watch it on PBS. And it can't be better timed. Certainly within a week or two of this date, we will find out about the listing, and you will see far more front page headlines one way or the other. Maybe a lot more if it is listed, but it'll be out there in the news. And the more you can tell people about the loveliness of this place, the more people will care, and that matters. We'd love it if you'd use our film as a postcard of your backyard. Tell people with pride, this is where I live. This is my home. Don't just keep telling them about the mountains that you can get to in 30 minutes. Tell them about the sagebrush the other way. And they can find it online at any time they want at Nature's website. You can watch it. It's free. We are giving it away to anybody who will watch, because what we care about is people understanding what's here. So I'm going to turn it over now to our panelist, actually, to Brent. Diane's going to talk to you.
Thank you so very much, Mark, for sharing this wonderful creation from your lab. And you have overseen, and I know many of you have seen the entire film, and it's just wonderful. So thank you for introducing that to some of you who perhaps haven't seen the whole thing. So I now would like to introduce our moderator this evening, and I know that many of you watched Brent Boynton on his own program, and he has been so kind to collaborate with us and help to make this a very special evening, and we are very appreciative and look forward to your guidance with our panel, and he will introduce our panelists. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Diane. Panelists, come on down. My first job is going to be introduce them, and I first have to see where they're going to sit. So it's kind of my flashcard routine. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. In case you heard all the sneezing and coughing, that was me. I've decided I'm allergic to sage-grouse, so let's just get rid of them all. That's my egg. Starting at your left of the table is Mr. Alan Miyagi. He's a third-generation Nevadan from Douglas County and a graduate from the University of Nevada, Reno. He has degrees in hydrology and in architectural engineering design. Mr. Miyagi served as the director of Nevada's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which is a cabinet-level position under Governors Gwynn and Gibbons, and as the administrator of the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection under Governors Miller and Gwynn. During his tenure with the state of Nevada, Mr. Miyagi served on numerous boards and commissions, including the Commission on Workplace Safety, the Governor's Climate Change Commission, the Lake Tahoe Bi-State Fire Commission, and he also sat on the governing board of the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency for 6 years, including 3 years as its chairman. After 31 years of public service, Mr. Miyagi retired in 2010. He's currently principal of A. Miyagi and Associates, a natural resource and consulting firm. He also sits on the board of the Tahoe Fund, which is a nonprofit organization that secures private money for environmental, recreational, and educational projects in the Tahoe Basin. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
Next to Alan is Casey KC. She is the warm-up artist for Duran Duran. I'm kidding. Casey is her real first name, and her last name is unpronounceable. That's her husband's fault. So the rest of us just abbreviate it with the letters K and C. Did I do okay with that, Casey? Okay. She is the program manager for the Sagebrush Ecosystem Program, which is, as I understand it, means that she works with the state agencies whose responsibilities overlap in the sagebrush ecosystem and works to implement the state plan devised by the Sagebrush Ecosystem Council. Keep up with me, there will be a test on this. The Sagebrush Ecosystem Council was established by Governor Brian Sandoval in 2012. Alan Miyagi, Tina Nappie, and Devin Lister on our panel are all members of that council. It has more members representing a large swath of Nevada land users. The council created our state plan, which is essentially our official plan for dealing with sage-grouse issues. And Casey and her staff work with the various state agencies to make that policy really happen. Before becoming program manager, Casey served as a conservation staff specialist for the Nevada Division of Forestry. She was primarily responsible for the statewide hazardous fuel reduction program. She worked with multiple state, local, and federal partners and landowners to spread education and prevention against catastrophic loss in wildland fires, and in implementing strategically placed treatments on the landscapes. That's government speak. In other words, she managed the process of getting rid of the dead stuff and the ladder fuels. Casey also managed the Volunteer Fire Assistance Program, which provided equipment and training to the qualifying volunteer fire departments in our state. Casey started with NDF as a seasonal employee at the State Tree Nursery in 2002, then moved into the state office working for the fire program. And before the Division of Forestry, she served a little over 2 years in the Peace Corps, doing community forestry work in Nepal. Casey has a BS in forestry, in specifically research conservation, from the University of Montana in Missoula. All right, do we have Beth? Now, Devin Lister, I'm going to have to look up as we speak because we had a little miscommunication on his bio, but it's not his fault, so it's not my fault that I may have to read this off my phone either. Born and raised just outside of Pioche, Nevada, Devin Lister has a lifelong love for the outdoors, wildlife, and for agriculture. He graduated from Utah State University with a degree in water and biological engineering. He returned to Pioche to help build the family farm, and Devin has raised his family of 6 children there. The children have grown, and the farm has grown from an 80-acre weekend project to a 700-acre alfalfa-producing operation. Devin's passion for the outdoors, wildlife, and agriculture have led him to be involved in many venues. He's served on the State Wildlife Commission, the Lincoln County Public Lands Commission, the Nevada Farm Bureau Board, and many other councils and committees, including 25-plus years with the Boy Scouts. Devin currently serves as the Nevada Farm Bureau Federation Vice President and Nevada Sagebrush Ecosystem Council. A dedicated husband and father, Devin strives to help those around him. As an advocate of agriculture, wildlife, and the outdoors, Devin takes care to do his homework and footwork to best serve all. Devin Lister. Greg Tanner is another native Nevadan. I feel like a newcomer surrounded by these folks. He's originally from Yerington. He grew up hunting, fishing, and exploring remote rural Nevada as a child while living in mining camps where his father was employed. And those early experiences spawned and cultivated his interest in working with natural resources. He graduated from UNR with a degree in Renewable Natural Resource Management. And he went to work for Nevada's Department of Fish and Game while he was in college. It stuck. While in college, he went to work for Fish and Game, and then he stayed with what became the Nevada Department of Wildlife. After he graduated, he worked out of Las Vegas, Yerington, Fallon, and Reno, primarily in the avian and terrestrial wildlife arena. He worked with the federal land management agencies as well as private landowners. Mr. Tanner worked on numerous wildlife conservation efforts and initiatives, including sage-grouse and sage-grouse habitat management. He retired in 2004 as the Game Bureau Chief, which is a position he'd held in the last 10 years of his career with the state. After he retired, he trained dogs and worked as the staff biologist for the Nevada Wilderness Project. For the last several years, he's been self-employed, working with a Northern Nevada landowner as his representative in pursuing conservation easements for his ranches. The objective is to maintain the ranches as viable agricultural operations, while maintaining and enhancing the high quality private land habitat for wildlife, primarily sage-grouse. His wife, Joanne, is a retired teacher from Churchill County School District. They've been married for 40 years. Greg says wildlife conservation has been his lifelong pursuit, and he's been fortunate to have been a key player in past successful wildlife conservation efforts, and he's hopeful that he'll be a party to more in the future. Greg Tanner. And to my immediate left, Tina Nappie, another very native Nevadan. She was born and grew up in Washoe Valley, the daughter of a photographer and artist who tried to earn a living first by raising leghorns for eggs, and secondly with a divorce ranch. Similar pursuits.
In the ranching community.
Yes. She graduated from UNR with a degree in English literature and a teaching degree. Her primary employment was, or at least the development of her main field, was through the Foresta Institute for Ocean and Mountain Studies, located in Washoe Valley. That's where she developed a red book of Nevada's rare and endangered species to complement the International Red Book of Endangered Species and the emerging U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listing of rare and endangered species. In other words, she was researching these things before the federal government started listing them. Mrs. Nappie's primary career was in JOIN and Nevada Works. That's a program which provided employment and training services in the 13 northern Nevada counties. She served as director for a number of years and was involved in economic development. Meanwhile, on the side, she was working as a volunteer focusing on Nevada wildlife, writing about, lobbying for, and serving on various boards, including the State Board of Wildlife Commissioners, several BLM advisory boards, and the state of Nevada's brief journey into water planning. She also served as editor for a time of the Toyabe Trails, the Toyabe chapter of the Sierra Club newsletter. For Tina, service on the Sagebrush Council is a continuum of that passion for wildlife, enjoyment of a variety of perspectives, and anticipation of improving conditions for wildlife, and of course, being invited to participate. Her bottom line, Nevada, no matter what its shortcomings, is a great state. Tina Nappie. Well, thanks to Dr. Dantzker and the Sagebrush Sea excerpt, we now probably have a pretty good idea of what the sage-grouse is. Let me ask right first, what about the difference between the greater sage-grouse that we hear about and the bi-state sage-grouse? Is there any difference? Anybody feel free to jump in. Yes, Greg.
Is this working?
Yes, you're on.
It takes a few minutes to explain, but I'll explain a little bit about how it came about.
Well, how about the 30-second explanation? Are we talking about the same bird?
They're the same bird,
Okay.
except the bi-state has unique genetic characteristics. That wasn't determined until DNA technology became available. And that happened in the mid-1990s. There was a rather embarrassing situation that occurred in Utah and Colorado, whereby it was once thought that the Gunnison sage-grouse was a greater sage-grouse. It's a separate species. So that brought attention to all of the states. You better see what you got for sage-grouse. And that precipitated an effort range-wide whereby all of the states contracted with the University of Denver and sent their samples in, at which time they were analyzed, and it was determined that the birds range-wide exhibited the same genetic characteristics and consequently were the same bird, with the exception of the bi-state. The bi-state had unique genetic characteristics. It's not a different species or subspecies. It just possesses different genetic characteristics. However, that characteristic under the Endangered Species Act qualifies it for a separate listing, and consequently it was petitioned for listing as a distinct population segment of the greater sage-grouse.
Okay. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is required to make a decision on or before the 30th of this month as to whether to list the greater sage-grouse, if I'm not mistaken, as an endangered species. Do all of Nevada's sage-grouse fall under that designation? No.
With the exception of the bi-state.
Okay, with the exception of the bi-state. Very good. So the bi-state will not be listed on the 30th.
That determination was made earlier late last year, and the service determined not to list the bi-state population.
Okay? Now, our big reason for caring, if it weren't for the beautiful documentary pictures we had, if that was just a bird and we have plenty more birds, why does Nevada care about the potential for listing? What can happen to our state as a consequence of the sage-grouse getting endangered species listing? Anyone care to jump in on that? Go ahead, Devin. And Tina, you can grab the microphone too. Go ahead, Devin.
I'll let Tina go first.
Well, in the first place, I'm not sure there's more than, there's endangered, threatened, or not listed. So
Okay.
there's three options here to look at. And I know economically there's a big concern about this. And I certainly would have some concerns myself. And I think that it was already mentioned that in order to avoid a listing, there has been a tremendous amount of work done, which we might discuss, because there has been a huge amount of work done in understanding the bird and the habitat and how best to do range management. And there's also been a considerable investment financially. And it's those characteristics that ensure that the bi-state would not be listed. Just so we know that if you have a plan in place that you're willing to fund and you really work together, that perhaps there's not the need to list the bird.
Okay.
So.
Bevan, what's at stake if the sage-grouse gets protected species listing? Endangered species, I'm sorry.
I guess those that know me will know that I'm the least politically correct of the group here. So the potential for listing of the sage-grouse would have tremendous economic and social impacts on all aspects of the state. Even the metropolitan areas of the state use the open spaces in the state for recreation. And the amount of restrictions that would be in place with a listing would severely curtail both economic development, current economic and production practices, as well as those recreation opportunities. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Greg?
The way that a listing could potentially affect the state, using the state as an example, is through the consultation requirement contained within the Endangered Species Act. That means any proposed federal action or any activity that has a federal nexus associated with it. What's a federal nexus? Well, anything that you spend federal dollars on, whether it be an individual or the state or whoever, that's a federal nexus. Any of those activities will require a formal consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with regards to the potential impact of the proposed action.
Now, does that get down to the level of grazing rights?
It's much bigger than that. Yes, it absolutely would potentially affect grazing permits, but it's bigger than that. I regularly observe people misunderstanding the potential impact of a listing, in that a lot of people consider this to be a rural issue. It's as much of an urban issue as anything. And why would it be that? Well, just some examples. The water situation. Las Vegas being an example. What are they short of? Where are they planning to get water? But potentially two sources right now. One is the Colorado River drainage, obviously, where they're putting the third intake into Lake Mead to obtain water. The entire upper Colorado River watershed is sage-grouse habitat. And actions in that watershed could potentially affect the future of water. In or the eastern Nevada valleys where it's been proposed that water be obtained to support Las Vegas. How are they going to get it there? Any conveyance other than a truck is going to cross, well, any conveyance you can imagine crosses sage-grouse habitat. So those are some examples. And of course, there's a whole, one of the points that I want to make, and then I'll let somebody else talk, but we don't know what we have no way of knowing the breadth of the impact, because then we would have to look into the future and know what the proposed actions are before we would know the full extent of the impact of a listing.
Well, can we look at other examples? Let's say the desert tortoise in southern Nevada, and say this was handled in this particular way, so this is what we would expect.
Using that as an example, when the desert tortoise was listed, the Las Vegas Valley was being developed very rapidly. Casino expansion, urban expansion. Basically, the Las Vegas Valley was being excavated. And all of that was desert tortoise habitat. The feds listed it, which required that development, anytime there's federal funding involved, required that type of development, required a consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. The long and the short of it over time was that all of the affected entities got together, about 30 different entities, and they developed what's called the Clark County Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan. And ultimately what happened was that the Fish and Wildlife Service allowed development within the Las Vegas Valley to continue, but they precluded development elsewhere in Clark County as a mitigation.
Okay.
And so that's using an example of what potentially could happen with another species.
Alan Biaggi, since you've worked a lot with the Mining Association, what would be the economic impacts to the mining industry of a listing?
Well, I think that the mining industry will tell you that probably the one thing that is most detrimental to their business is uncertainty. And one thing that a potential listing brings is time delays and uncertainty whether or not you can permit a mine. And I think it's important to recognize that in Nevada, the greatest threat to the bird is not mining, it's not energy development, it's not livestock grazing, it's fire and it's invasive species. And in Nevada, we're in a very cyclical arrangement where we have fire, it burns our sagebrush. Following in behind the fire is cheatgrass, which burns, which further exacerbates the problem, further burns more sagebrush. For Nevada, that is our greatest threat. So we need to always keep that in mind and keep that context, that that's really what we need to watch out for the most. Does mining, grazing, and energy development have impacts? Absolutely it does, but they're smaller in comparison. But to get to your question again, a potential listing has huge potential impacts to the mining industry through uncertainty, through potential withdrawals of mineral entry, and for permitting delays.
Given a listing and asking what if again, what protections would the bird receive, and what would be the likely impact on populations? Bevan, I saw you smile. You have.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm going to share the different perspective here because, from my point of view, a listing would be death to the bird.
In what way? Because it would sound like it would protect the bird.
Well, federal management is the biggest threat to the bird right now. Hands down, and I'll state that in any venue. Fire is increased because of the way that federal lands are managed. Species have decreased because of the way that federal lands are managed. The restrictive management, there isn't any management done anymore, it's just restriction. And restriction isn't going to solve the problem. In fact, the reason that the sage-grouse blossomed and populations exploded immediately following the most extensive natural resource use in the state was because the ranching population was there putting water in a lot of various places. Trees were cut. The sagebrush ecosystem expanded tremendously. Once we turned the corner in the 1970s to a restrictive and preservation-minded way of management, you can look at the numbers, and I know that science is, everybody's got their own piece of science, but the facts, all you have to do is look at the facts. And since restrictive management has been put in place, deer populations have declined. Pygmy rabbit is one of the indicator species. Populations have declined, and the sage-grouse populations have declined. There is not a solution in restriction. There is not the idea that Mark, the one slide I guess I have problems with is the idea that pre-colonial we had these millions and millions of birds. Well, I don't know, because we don't have records from pre-colonial. We do know that the early explorers brought extra horses with them because there was nothing to eat, and they ate their extra horses. That's a fact. That's written in journals. After settlement, after we started to colonize and like I said, develop different areas and use some of the resources, that's the period of time that we saw the greatest explosion in our wildlife populations.
In talking to all of you panelists before this event, I realized that the history is not necessarily well understood, and that drawing conclusions based on that history may be somewhat controversial. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that before we forge ahead? Greg?
Well, I will comment. I would agree with Devin that we experienced an eruption of sage-grouse populations. They likely peaked in the late 1950s in Nevada. Like other sagebrush obligate species, including well-known species like mule deer and black-tailed jackrabbits, and there are some reasons. There were a sequence of events that all came together that resulted in a different sagebrush ecosystem that was favorable to these species. So there were good reasons why it happened, but unfortunately, the common thinking is that we had great numbers during the pre-colonial period, and then they've gradually diminished. That is not the case.
And in talking with you, I think that you would contend that it was largely through the management of man that the sage-grouse blossomed to be beyond what would have been historic levels at that time.
Well, it wasn't intentional. It was just the sequence of events that occurred. I'll give you two great examples. Some of the major influences. The first was the deforestation that occurred in conjunction with the early mining activity in Nevada, beginning in about 1860 and then commencing through 1900. We have a little bit of difficulty visualizing the extent of deforestation that occurred. But can you imagine all of the timber surrounding Lake Tahoe cut? It was for Virginia City, as an example. The old newspapers cite many situations, for example, around Ione in central Nevada, where the pinyon juniper there was clear cut for a 50-mile radius around those mining camps. So, and obviously that was the source of fuel for the people that were mining, in addition to making steam for milling and processing, that type of thing. So there were good reasons, but that deforestation was an action on the landscape that resulted in the emergence of a favorable shrub community that the sagebrush obligate species later took advantage of. Another huge influence on the landscape was the intensive livestock grazing that occurred initially it was cattle between 1850 and 1889. That was the year that we had the hardest winter on record in Nevada. It literally killed 80 to 90% of the cattle on all of the landscape in Nevada. Following that period, the nomadic sheep operations from other states took advantage of a void, and they moved into the state in huge numbers, peaking about 1910, where we had between 2 and 3 million sheep on the landscape in Nevada. That's a huge number compared to today's approximately 90,000. So what did the place look like after 3 million sheep were on it? It's actually recorded because the landowners of the day at the time were so concerned about the huge impacts of these nomadic domestic sheep operations. By the way, they were from somewhere else. They weren't from Nevada. But they lobbied their congressional representatives, and their concern was watershed. They were concerned that heavy winters were going to bring all that soil right down onto their private lands due to the intensity. So the first thing that happened was that Congress designated those lands national forest reserves. Those were the precursors to our national forest lands in Nevada today. The first thing that happened upon that congressional designation was that they sent biologists and range people out here to document the landscape. They photographed the landscapes on the tops of the mountain ranges. All of that's in the Library of Congress, some in local libraries, but literally the land, it all looks the same when you look at those photographs taken in 1906, 1907, 1908. You got bare ground with some sagebrush stobs sticking up. The country had been denuded of a lot of its vegetation. So following that period, we had some real big winters, a lot of vegetation. The result was a huge emergence of a shrub community upon a landscape that had been severely compromised with intensive livestock grazing. So you've got deforestation that occurred here. You've got broad-scale livestock grazing that occurred by both cattle and domestic sheep, and then a period of, and by the way, that subsided. That declined after about 1920, but you had a huge emergence of a shrub community, including bitterbrush, sagebrush, and the sagebrush obligate species followed that trend upwards.
Okay, and thank you for that. I'm going to direct this next question to Casey. Let me turn that question around. This is the what-if question. If the sage-grouse does not get federal protection, what protection will it get as a result of state action and as a result of the council?
Is mine on here?
Yes.
So, I mean, the state plan, regardless of a state listing of the bird or a federal listing of the bird, the state plan will be enacted as it's intended to. Currently, we're also working on the strategic action plan that takes some of the higher level thinking and actions in the state plan and makes them into something that we can actually set a date to and say who's doing that. And all of that gets enacted regardless of a listing decision. This SEC, the Sagebrush Ecosystem Council, the Sagebrush Ecosystem Technical Team, which I represent, those all remain. It was very strategically named the Sagebrush Ecosystem Program, not sage-grouse, because we are concerned about the ecosystem as a whole. We're currently looking at sage-grouse, but we do hope to expand to all obligate species
And that is
and to the ecosystem as a whole.
That's an important point about tonight's discussion, as well as the Sagebrush Sea. It is a whole environmental area, and are there other species and other elements that we need to be looking at in addition to sage-grouse?
Yeah, yes.
Tina, would you borrow Greg's microphone, would you?
Get it away from me. Well, there's about 350 species of plants and animals that are part of the sagebrush system. And of course, they're all going to be vulnerable the way we have looked at it. What I think would be maybe helpful, because to me, dealing with the sage-grouse and the sagebrush system requires all of us to get involved and to maybe think differently than we have thought before. And I believe some of this came up in Marc's movie. We have all, I'm native Nevadan and some of us are here. As we grew up, we always looked across that sagebrush at the mountains beyond. And we have done a very good job of saving some of those mountains in wilderness areas. We have saved water in wildlife refuges. We have saved the Black Rock Desert because it's a desert, it's historical, it's aesthetic. But when you look at all those places we've saved, there's only one place that has meaningful sage-grouse in it, and that's the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge. It was saved for pronghorn. So what we're looking at when we look at the Sagebrush Sea, we're looking at lands that have been sort of owned. They're owned by grazing permits, they're owned by prospecting and mining claims, they're owned by all of us as we ride our off-highway vehicles in. They're owned by the horse people who don't want a single horse removed from the herd management areas. So what we have is a landscape that has heavy use, as has already been mentioned. And it's whether it's the sage-grouse is listed or not, we have to deal with that, and we have to deal with fire, or in trying to remove or reduce the impact of fire. And the Sagebrush Ecosystem Council at the state level, to me, is one of the first really good steps in that direction. Because it is going to be fire and weeds and pinyon juniper invasions. And yes, we have to deal with grazing permits. Obviously, I don't agree with Devin on everything.
I'm shocked.
Oh, come on, Tina.
But I think there is a huge opportunity, and it's an opportunity that we all have to buy into, because in the long run, it's going to recreate some restraints on all of our behavior if we want to save the sage-grouse and everything in that system. And the history is subject to interpretation. There are a lot of different ways to look at it. But one of the things that has happened that I think is wonderful over the last few years is the huge investment in study on how best to, which lands are most important for recovering, which lands are best for pinyon juniper removal, which lands are best for reseeding. That's a learning experience. You just don't arrive knowing that. You have to study it and get the best out of it. So my concern about listing this as endangered is that I don't want to lose the cooperation and the working together that has come about over the last few years. And I hope it wouldn't. The Fish and Wildlife Service cannot do this by itself. It has to involve all of us. And we have to be more involved at the state level financially. And the state, under Governor Sandoval and the legislature, has made a very good first step on that. So I don't want to be negative about this. There's so many good things that are positive for the sage-grouse. My concern is if it's not listed, is that all of this investment will drop and the energy. That's something we have to really think about. But as we discuss this evening, I think it would be nice if any of you had ideas about things that could be done. And maybe we need to save different kinds of lands. We need different parks, or we need different set-asides. But just remember that you and I helped to save lands that didn't really include the sage-grouse for the most part.
And thank you. And we would like to get to audience questions and comments in just a moment. But first, Alan, did you want to chime in on that?
No, I think Tina did a very good job.
Okay, you leaned forward very purposefully.
Not at all.
Brad, I would like.
Bevan's
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in.
That was Bevan you saw.
I agree with Tina. It's imperative that the focus that's been started here continues, that we continue to work towards solutions here within the state, and gather all entities together. I'm going to go back to the statement that I made before. I'll disagree with Tina that special designations or restrictions do not benefit because those become non-managed lands. They just become a future fire. A special designation, whether it's a wilderness area, whether it's a conservation area, whatever you call it, it just becomes a non-managed area. That's why I said the federal government would be the crippling of the bird population. The federal government, the BLM, has specific direction to manage the wild horse population, which they have utterly failed to do. They have specific direction to manage for certain rangeland health, which they have miserably failed to do. The idea that because we give a piece of land a special designation and tell everybody to stay off doesn't mean that it's ever going to be good wildlife habitat. And it's definitely not going to improve if it's not currently good wildlife habitat.
You see that basically evolving as the neighbor's house undergoing foreclosure and the weeds in the yard. You see that as the bank's management of that property as being similar to federal management of public land.
Absolutely. That's a great picture. Thank you.
Well, Casey, how many of these state things, you say that they are actually happening? What have we learned from all this? What have we gained from this, whether the bird is listed or not? Will this continue forward? If we think, well, we dodged a bullet, we don't have to worry about that anymore.
Well, I would always like to think so. I'm an optimist. I think what Tina said is very true. We've built a lot of relationships that have never really been built before, and I think sage-grouse can be, given the credit for that because it brought a lot of us together. It probably should have happened a long time ago. We all should have been working together in land management, resource management for years, and we have been working alongside of each other for a long time and together on some issues. Firefighting, we do a good job at working together on, but I think that those relationships will continue regardless of what happens with the listing decision. And beyond sage-grouse, hopefully into just all of our land management issues. Managing for multiple resources is hard, and multiple uses is hard, and it's difficult. And from the state's perspective, it's different, and from a federal perspective, it's different. From everyone's perspective, it's different. And I think if the areas that are being successful, if you look at recent areas that are getting a lot of project work done, and the way they're doing that is through real collaboration, through processes of all of them coming together and building a plan that maybe not everyone's happy about, but at least can get implemented and does something good out there. And there's a lot of success stories like that right now. And it's really, it's an exciting time. I mean, I think what's gonna come out of this, regardless of the listing decision, is a really good working relationship between the federal, the state agencies, industry, and everyone, and really working together to make things work for the state of Nevada.
20 years from now, this will be a better looking picture?
Yeah.
Okay.
About when I retire.
On that optimistic note, would anyone from the audience like to ask questions at this point? Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Bevins, what would you like to see happen to the land out there? And are you interested in the sage-grouse, or what would be your preference for these back areas of Nevada?
Each area is different, and that's why federal management fails, is because a bunch of folks in Washington, D.C. cannot write a management plan that is going to cover all aspects of everywhere. It has been a tremendous challenge as a council to sit down and write a plan just to address the issues here in the state of Nevada. I believe that the plan that the council has put together will be effective and has the tools in it to adaptively manage all of the different parts of Nevada's landscape. I'm not sure, did that answer your question?
Not quite. I was just thinking what I get the sense that development or some form of use of the land is more desirable for you, and I want to know what that is. What would you prefer seeing the land being used for?
Each piece of land has its opportunities, I guess, if I can use a better term. I see a lot of the state of Nevada, and it's very diverse. There are, most of the state has been used for grazing for generations. And most of it, other than some periods that there was not any kind of management, that most of it is managed fairly productively and for long-term sustaining. Grazing is a valid use. Mining is a valid use. Energy production is a valid use, each in their individual places. But non-management, I don't think, is a valid approach. There is, in my country, yeah, I live down there in the Netherlands part of Nevada.
It's a different country.
It's a different country. Fire is not our issue with the sagebrush ecosystem. Pinyon juniper encroachment is the issue. And those lands, yes, will eventually burn, and they will burn in catastrophic fires. Much of that, unfortunately, has been locked up in wilderness that then cannot be reseeded into fire-resistant species. It cannot be managed. It's a what did Louis Provincier call it? A black hole heading toward a vicious cycle of fire and invasive weeds.
So that's your thing, is it's fire and invasive weeds are the product of federal management policies across Nevada?
Yes. Yes, I believe that.
Your view of the federal intervention?
Yes.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I don't know who would answer this, but here we're in a drought. You get these lightning storms without any rain. How do you prevent fire in the sagebrush?
Let me repeat the question just in case you weren't able to all hear it in the audience. Considering that we have natural fires here caused by lightning, how do you prevent fire at least damaging fires in sagebrush country?
Brent, I'll start with that one, and then Casey can fill in. The key to fighting fires in Nevada is catching them early. The key is to try and capture 100% of the fires when they're an acre or less. If you can capture the small fires and you can put them out. It's when they start to grow and get larger and larger and larger, they get out of hand. I pulled up some statistics before coming in today of some of the acreage that's been burned in Nevada over the last 10 or 12 years. Year 2000, 700,000 acres. 2001, 600,000 acres. 2005, almost 1.5 million acres. 2006, 1.3 million acres. So when we let those small fires become large, we have these catastrophic fires, and that's where we lose our sage-grouse and sagebrush habitat. The other thing that we can do, and the federal government has really come around to this, it used to be that if there was a timber fire in Montana or a timber fire in Oregon, that fire took priority. And they said, it's just Nevada, it's just sagebrush, let it burn. They've come around to recognize the valuable habitat that sagebrush is, and they've put it on a par with big timber in terms of allocating resources to fight fires. So that's another big change. Another thing we can do is put in fire breaks within our sagebrush habitat so that if a fire does occur, it maybe will burn up to that fire break, and it gives us a chance to fight it at that point and not get significantly larger than it might be. So there are some techniques that we can use. The Nevada Division of Forestry has been very good over the last few years of sending resources, their helicopters from here on the Sierra front, out to Elko County to help address those fires as they occur in their sagebrush lands. Casey, I'm sure you have more you'd like to say on that.
I would just say, yeah, you don't prevent fires in Nevada. Fire is a natural occurring event in Nevada. And one thing I think that's taken us a long time to come to terms with is that not all fire is bad. There are some fires, I mean, we have tried to stop every fire, and by doing that, we've overstocked a lot of the forests, and a lot of the forests that look healthy to us are not healthy because that wasn't its natural stocking level historically. So at the scale at which we're looking at things, we can't do a whole bunch to prevent it, but we can do a lot more to stop it from catastrophic loss or coming in the right areas and rehabbing in the right ways. I mean, there's a lot of strides being made to try to change the way that we're looking at the rehabilitation of fires. I think before we've just kind of blanketed rehab across landscapes, and we're learning a lot more now about native source seeds and areas where we could do plantings that would be more successful. We're not very successful with flying sagebrush seed over in a helicopter, but we are successful in planting islands of sagebrush and getting them to grow again. So I think that what we have to look at is fire is going to happen here, and we are going to lose some landscapes, but what can we do after the fire, and what can we do ahead of it? Thinning the fuels, getting rid of the dead and the down, taking some, thinning the trees to a smaller stocking level so that when fire comes through, it would do what it naturally did, which is clean up the understory, but not take out the entire area. So there's a lot we can do. It's such a large area to have it done in.
And a big change that's come around since, I think, 1917, when cheatgrass was first discovered in Nevada, is we've got this invasive species. Previously, when fire went through the landscape, eventually the sagebrush would come back. Now the cheatgrass, the medusa head, and these invasive species outcompete the sagebrush, and it doesn't come back again. It's going to take man intervention for that sagebrush to once again reestablish. Sagebrush grows slowly. We're looking at 15, 20, 30, 50 years for it to return.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Two-part question. You mentioned that the sage-grouse is bi-state. What two states are those? And then are the populations of the greater sage-grouse, how many are those versus the bi-state? Am I missing something?
States, California, and Nevada, that's all I can answer.
I'll take a stab at it. So we're really talking, as Greg has talked about, is two populations of the bird. When we're talking bi-state, it's a very small population, and it's Nevada and California from about Lyon County down to about Bishop, right along the California-Nevada border. The greater sage-grouse is in 11 western states. It's that huge expanse that Mark showed on the map. So by state, 2 states, Nevada, California, very limited population size.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have a long list of questions, but to keep it short, I'll just address 2 of my questions. My first one is the gentleman was talking about desertification. Now, I saw a video when I very first came to Nevada a long time ago about how they take these big chains and they put tractors on either end of these huge chains and they go over the landscape, killing everything. And that is being proposed again. I just heard it at a Wildlife Commission meeting. As a matter of fact, that's part of the plan. To me, that's going to cause more desertification. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about the consequences of vilifying the natural plants that are supposed to grow here for shade, for pinyon nuts, for pine nuts, for cover for animals. All I hear is vilification of these species of plants that are native to our state and that I think have aesthetic value besides the other values I've mentioned. So to me, that's a very scary proposition, and it sounds really exaggerated. And the second vilification that's taking place are ravens. And the numbers of ravens that have already been killed are huge. And what they do is they put out poisoned eggs. I have no idea if the poison is getting into the food chain and thereby poisoning other animals in the food chain. I think it's out of control. I think it's indiscriminate. And I don't see vilifying species of animals or species of plants just in a rush to save this one bird. And again, I haven't heard any specifics from this panel about this economic disaster that we're supposedly facing. How exactly, precisely, is there a study that I can see that tells us exactly what is this economic disaster that will occur if the bird is listed? Thank you.
Well, there are three questions. Let's start with the first, with the vilification of plant species. Who'd like to tackle that?
I
mean, do you want to take that?
Well, I'm not sure, not knowing what the project is. I know there are some places in the state where the sagebrush has gotten so tall and it's really maybe killed off the understory. But I don't know, I'm not sure any of us up here knows anything about that particular project.
Yeah, and
I'll speak to, you want to go ahead?
I'll go after you.
Okay. The practice that you're referring to is chaining. It's usually used to manage the pinyon juniper. That is a very rapidly expanding population into areas that were originally rangelands or what they call rangeland sites. I'm not the guy to talk about what was the on the council that moved off. McAdoo, Kent. What was his about site-specific evaluation and site potential and all that good stuff? I'm not that scientist, so I can't tell you about it. But the use of chains to reduce pinyon juniper stands has been in place for years before you started, wasn't it, Greg?
Oh, yeah.
And then perhaps I should follow up with, why is pinyon juniper bad, at least in some places or some concentrations? Why do we not revere it like we do the sagebrush?
It creates a expansive monoculture, and where there is no understory under it that is, yeah, it's nice and green to drive by, but nothing lives there.
It takes over.
Yeah, it takes over. Occasionally there are pine nuts, but certainly not every year. Kind of like 1 in 5, or sometimes when it rains. But I don't know as it's a vilification of any kind of species. It's management practices. And when the gentleman asked me before about what do you want to see where, well, there are woodland sites, there are range sites. I'm not talking about, nobody's talking about desertification. When a range site becomes taken over with pinyon juniper, then everything else leaves. And so we're in a place where we're focused on the sagebrush ecosystem. Pinyon juniper expansion in some areas of the state is destroying the sagebrush ecosystem. So somewhere along the line, we have to decide what our priorities are.
And let me
Did I miss
just,
anything?
And I guess just one other thing, maybe to get to the basic issue. Sage-grouse don't like to be around trees. And the reason for that is that the predators, the eagles, the ravens, the hawks, sit in those trees, and they can very carefully watch where this sage-grouse are nesting. They can see the little ones, and they pick them off very easily. So when you look at sage-grouse habitat, it's typically in areas where there are no trees. And over the last 100, 150 years, we've seen pinyon and juniper expansion significantly in the state. And just to give you an idea of how intertwined all of our resource issues are, is that we have, as a council, have been saying pinyon juniper, not good, we've got to try and reduce it. And quite frankly, 5 guys and chainsaws over a summer can do a lot in terms of enhancing grouse habitat. But we heard our Native American representative at our last Sagebrush Ecosystem Council saying, hey, we need to stop, we need to think about this, because pinyon and juniper are very important to Native people. They're a food source. There's some spiritual significance to them. And so what we run into all the time is these values are intertwined. And we were talking at the reception earlier tonight that it's like whack-a-mole. You hit something here, something else pops up over there. So we need to be, the challenge of really of the Sagebrush Ecosystem Council is how do you balance all of these values and manage the land for multiple use? It's a very difficult thing, and it's a huge challenge for the land management agencies. And we always talk about, the devils of BLM or the devils of the Forest Service, but they've got an extremely difficult job to try and balance all of the uses on our public lands.
Now, let me just skip over the raven question and just get to the economic impact, because we're basically out of time. Does anyone want to tackle the question about the severity of economic impact if there were a sage-grouse listing?
To my knowledge, nobody has attempted that feat yet, but I think it suffice it to say that we can't, at this point in time, we don't know what the ramifications of a listing would be. Ultimately, that would be tied to the consultation process required under the Endangered Species Act with the Fish and Wildlife Service and their ability to effect a permit to maintain, mitigate, or restore sage-grouse and or their habitats. So we really have no way of knowing. I don't know how you'd put that data together, but suffice it to say that we do know that it affects virtually everybody in Nevada, not just rural or urban, and it would be a significant thing. Now, I'm going to make a statement a little bit about, just very quickly, along those lines. One of the problems we've got with this is money. The more recently completed plan is not the first plan in Nevada. We've had other plans. Their failures, frankly, have been funding on behalf of the state. When you go through a budget process in the state of Nevada, and I say this anecdotally after years of working for them, that when ultimately your budget goes to the legislature and is approved and then goes back to the governor, the priorities are such that education is funded first, health and human services get funded, natural resource management is always at the bottom, and historically has been in Nevada. Nevada is challenged by itself to be able to fund a lot of this management that we're talking about. This is expensive stuff. You talk about pinyon juniper treatment on a per acre basis. I was involved in one down in the Bridgeport district. We're talking about $5,000 an acre. It gets a little expensive. So along the lines of what Tina mentioned earlier, the only way that we're going to be able to undertake management of sage-grouse in Nevada is to utilize all of the available partners. And that includes the federal agencies. Historically, some of our major industries have been extremely helpful with their funding. Primarily the mining industry has just been superb in the past in terms of coming up with the money to fund expensive projects to benefit the critters. So anyway, we're challenged by money, and it takes money for management, proper management. So those are just a few anecdotal comments with regard on the economic aspect of things.
And you asked the question, where can you look at the economics of a potential listing? And I think if you look at the environmental impact statement that the federal agencies have put out, there is some economic analysis within that document if you want to go through all 1,800 pages of it. Another way to look at it is look at other species that have been listed and the economic impacts of those species. We've talked about the desert tortoise, spotted owl in the northwest, and any other number of species throughout the country.
And that leads to the final question I'd like to close on, because we are out of time. Where can anyone in our audience go to find more information about the topic, other than just a Google search? Is there any clearinghouse for information about the sagebrush habitat?
Google is best.
Okay. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.